I think there's a lot of interesting ways that I can backfill and see a pattern of what led me to here that at the time I wasn't like, I wasn't charting a course until I would say in college. And so when I look back, there were some key moments in my life that I would say that I think influenced me and planted a seed that later on I was like, that had a big influence on me. But at the time, it was not a conscious decision to do something. And I'd say I grew up, my dad is a retired Michigan State police officer. And so I grew up in a family that my dad was a police officer. A number of the men in my family were all in the military. And I went to a rural high school and was captain of the wrestling team by my senior year. And we took second at state. I worked on a farm milking cows for my wrestling coach. And he would make me do pull ups in between, which was really good training.
Yeah,
In terms
conditioning,
of,
yeah.
in terms of working conditions, it was pretty intense. But that experience of the discipline of wrestling and the intensity of wrestling was a really important thing in my life, as well as farming was a really important thing in my life that when I went to college and I started to get involved, I was ashamed of a lot of it. I was ashamed of both the athleticism parts because of the correlation sometimes between athletics and macho men behavior, in particular wrestling felt like a very macho sport. But I've always been a really sensitive person. I was sensitive. I cried easily throughout my childhood. Till this day, I
Mhm.
still will get teary eyed when I see something moving, or even I'm talking to someone, they share a moving story. I've had to figure out how to manage my own insecurity about that, as well as what I'm worried about other people think about that. But I've had a very open sensory environment to things that are that world systems that are unfair, people being mistreated. And so I think that there was that openness in that way. And I was planning to go into the military like my best friend and cousin did right out of high school. And he was a year ahead of me. So I've said this regularly on in different kinds of introductions of presentations that I was not gonna go to college. I was gonna go into the military. And fortunately, I had a number of family members that kind of convinced me that, that what if you just try college? And my dad was incredibly influential about saying, you're too argumentative. You're going to get thrown out. Like you're inquisitive
Too many
and argumentative.
questions.
And you always have questions and follow questions. So he was like, just try college. And so I went to Grand Valley with that. Like I was proud of it. I remember putting the Grand Valley sticker on my back window and being like, oh my God. But very few students from my high school went to college. And so it wasn't based on doing what everybody else is doing. I went not knowing what to really expect, but I was immediately captured in two really important ways. One, the opening orientation weekend speaker was Jane Elliott, and she just hit me so hard. I was the first time I saw the blue eye and brown eye experiment that she did with her elementary school students. And then she just ripped on white supremacy in a way that was so powerful and beautiful. And to see her do that on stage in front of hundreds at that time at Grand Valley in 98, I don't know what the incoming first year class was, but just didn't leave any doubt in my mind of here is this thing. It is not going away automatically. We are not just going to, oh, we'll just get new takes. Every generation will be a little bit better. And so I, said at the time to my girlfriend who went to Grand Valley with me afterwards that there's a before and an after that talk. Like I knew that was a fundamental change in my life. To this day, it was night and day. Like that, I want to fight. I want to fight against this system. And I think it was within a couple of months, I joined the Institute for Healing Racism on my campus. And the dean of the Multicultural Affairs office, Dean Williams, ran it with a couple of students. And it was just this incredible introduction to white supremacy, racism, that it was my first like literal semester in college. And it was so impactful. So that sort of pairing and then being around the social environment, which is the second part, which was I was all of a sudden in an environment where it wasn't made fun of to do your work. In my high school, I didn't try very hard and I did fine, but I I didn't care about education. I had no desire to go to college for education's, and it was this environment of where it was not a nerdy thing to do, but yeah, this is what we do when we're at college. We learn, and had really critically important professors that I took classes with that changed my life in the way I think about education, the way I think about learning. And so Grand Valley, literally, I can't sing its praises enough in the sense that I was not supposed to go there. I went there not wanting the thing that I ended up loving. Like it was a lot of fortunate things that happened. And so after those first couple of experiences about racism, I started talking to people and they were saying, "What do you know about feminism? What do you know about homophobia?" And so I was like, I'm certain I don't know about those. Like I didn't know
Mhm.
about
That's right.
racism in way, and I would like to learn more about it. So I was a sponge and I couldn't, there wasn't a cause that I was unwilling to say, tell me a bit about it. And the other credit I want to give is to, I worked at the Office of Student Life at Grand Valley, and that was my first job in college. Started out my first semester working there, and I got to see a lot of student organizations. So the kind of activist groups about students for a free to bed were important. The Students Against Sweatshops, I eventually was a part of. And then when I would work events at the Kirkhoff Center, primarily the events that I was working were dances that were being held by Black fraternities and sororities on campus that were part of the Divine Nine that were hosting these events. And so I was working these events and I had staff members who were coworkers with me. One was my supervisor, Davina Withers. Not only were we working this event, but she also saw in me a curiosity about what is Black Greek life, and the stepping that was happening at the shows was amazing. And so she took me under her wing and taught me about this culture that I had never experienced before, and this family feeling of when people got together and that were
Yeah.
dancing. It was just a really beautiful insight to something that I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing." And so I developed friendships with a number of folks who were willing to educate me about something that was such an awesome example of power and an awesome example of how important representation and community is that many Grand Valley students never got to see. And I did get to see that and form relationships because of that. And so I also owe a great deal of gratitude to the friends that sort of taught me through that. So then I studied abroad in Mexico on a social justice oriented program. And so I learned more about global inequalities in economic systems that discriminate intentionally, strategically, grinding people for them to exploit value from those communities to line their pockets. And so it was a sort of, again, it was a really beautiful part of my life that I still owe a lot of gratitude toward. And when I think about fighting, there's a lot of referencing those periods in my early life as a young 18, 20-year old. It's those moments where you're like, I can't unsee that. It's really hard to unsee that now
That's right.
and live my life in a certain way. It would be an intentional turning my back towards that. And I don't want to do that. And so when I had a chance to teach in the Muskegon Correctional Facility as an undergrad, and work with men in that system and to see their desire to learn and be self-reflective. And in a lot of ways, we're more invested in education and learning than a lot of my peers at Grand Valley who were just like doing the darn thing. And I didn't want to resent them, but I did. I would go to the prison to teach a class that I was not qualified to teach in a lot of ways, but they wanted it. And I got to be part of an environment and see the humanity in prison and men who have been convicted that are fully fledged human beings and want to be seen as that and demanded that. And it was such a resetting of all that, which forced me to have a lot of conversations with my dad because of his involvement with the criminal justice system. And our conversations about that led to a lot of things for him too. And he ended up becoming a real critic of policing and the way it's done, and especially has taken an interest in talking about the drug war. So the drug war to me became something that was intentionally, strategically racist and classist. No question in my mind. And so my dad and I were conversing about this. And while at the same time he was working on a homicide case about a man who was killed and dropped off at an exit on the freeway of 131 near our house, but was from Grand Rapids. And so he was working on this case and trying to talk with people in Grand Rapids about what happened to this man, trying to solve his case. And he experienced a couple of different sides. He experienced the sister who I eventually got to meet and do a class with. She was calling him every day about her brother being killed and what she was going to do. And my dad was like begging her, please do not go to this person's house. Please do not. But then he would go to people's house and say, let me do that. And he would go to the people's house and they didn't want to talk to him. And so he was telling me, like, Tony, I'm trying to work on figuring out who killed this man. And nobody wants to talk to me. And so I was bringing to him what I was learning in workshops and things at Grand Valley. That makes sense. They don't want to talk to you.
Oh yeah.
It makes total sense. And I understand you're trying to do right by finding out who killed this man. So that whole process was an evolution and a transformation in my relationship to my dad, because I started to have really negative feelings about my dad in our life, about his involvement with an institution that I had very little respect for after learning so many of the things I did about how police forces were even created. So that was really transformative for both of us. We still have regular talks about that. And he's gone on podcasts and radio shows to talk about the drug war. He was on a TV ad for ending marijuana criminalization. So he was like a voice as a retired state police officer saying that he believes that it's a really good thing to eliminate the criminal association with cannabis. So I'm just really proud of that transformation that he's made. And he had former colleagues of his call him up and accuse him of taking money from the marijuana industry and accusing him of being a pot, that type of stuff. And he was like, that's exactly what and it's ludicrous. He's motivated by the ills that he sees in the system.
I appreciate you saying that. Or one of the earlier things you talked about, like the importance of how we phrase things and it impacts what we do about them. It reminded me of work with some colleagues over at National Equity Project, and they do a lot of work around shifting discourse, shifting language. And I attended one of their workshops one year, and that's one of the things that they brought up when we say war on drugs. And so think about that phrasing and how then we organize time and resources. And then when it shifts to opioid crisis, think about how we organize our time and resources. So I just really appreciate you naming that in terms of the power of phrasing and that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
also, you said so many important things. One of the things that's jumping out to me that I want to ask you about, you mentioned there was a before and after for your talk. And what I got from what you were saying, so there's a before and after that talk you had. And then you're at this place of, okay, so now I'm aware of some things, and to live in a way that is acting outside of that awareness will be an intentional turning away from this information that I have. And so
Yeah.
that's an experience. And you've educated students. I've taught classes as well as an educator. That's something I've experienced too. Well, one in my own journey of learning and unlearning things, but then also teaching students. Sometimes as early as that first semester, after being exposed to some stuff, have to go back home on those breaks and holidays. And so when you talk about there was a before and after, sometimes we return back to a place, but we've changed, but the place that we're returning to may not have necessarily changed in some way. And maybe the place or dynamics or relationships, what have you, but the idea of, hey, we've learned some stuff and now we have this information, but then sometimes we have to go back and interact with folks who have not learned that. And we might be hearing some of the same stuff. So for me, it became harder to go back sometimes on those weekends and holidays. And I couldn't hear certain stuff. And it could be the pulpit or it could be with relatives or friends or whatever. I can't hear
Yeah.
certain things without challenging it. You know what I mean? And so those kind of dynamics, returning to a place that you've changed, but the place you've returned to hasn't changed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, quite a bit. Mainly, I would focus it on going back to my dad's house in the country. I think that when I would go home, I would say I'm not super proud of this, but when I started to get involved with struggles on campus and wanted to start, the identity formation in college is such an incredibly important part of it. But as a young, white, cisgen, heterosexual man, like I I was so embarrassed about so many things in my life, like not embarrassed of my actions. I don't ever remember saying anything overtly racist. I don't remember ever liking racist jokes at all. So it wasn't like I came from a place of being like, oh, I'm ashamed of all of that. But it's just being affiliated with ruralness and being affiliated with country music or being affiliated with knowing farm stuff. I made a really brutal sort of separation from that and took it as a kind of a point of a pride of rejecting all of that bigotry and associated things that I hated so much that kind of seemed to come along with that. And so I didn't really re-engage with any high school friends after high school. Like not until almost recently would I say that on Facebook or something that I have some connection still with high school friends, but a number of them have unfollowed and unfriended me because for a long period of time, Facebook was my place where I was putting a lot of my political feelings and ranting on it. And so a lot of people just self-selected. But I would say at that point of my life, and I would say even through into my 30s, I was really determined to slice and dice and cut out people that I didn't feel like were worth my time. I think some of them were necessary for like health reasons and to be like, I don't know, I cannot start the conversation there. But it was also a maturity thing. It was also a confidence thing that I find myself now being a little bit more capable of having conversations that 15, 10 years ago, I would have just dismissed the person, argued them down.
What's the shift
And
there? What do you feel like the shift is there for you?
is this decades long uncertainty about what my obligation is to people that come from places and that look and have privileges like me. I think I felt so embraced by communities that were actively fighting for their liberation and for the freedom from exploitation that I didn't have a need. I didn't want to like, what kind of friendships am I preserving if it's a relationship of me being like, you think other countries are bad. Like, where do I start with that? I'm a full-fledged believer and have worked in international education for 15 years. So when I studied abroad at Grand Valley, I ended up doing it 3 times. I came back from my program in Mexico and was even like resentful of anybody who would be like, so tell me about Mexico. How was it? And I'll be like, you don't even understand.
Mhm.
I was so caught up in my feelings and
Mhm.
so caught up. I saw something real again that I can never unsee. I will forever remain devoted to what I saw in Mexico as this incredibly important transformative process for me and people and communities that welcomed me in. I can never look at Mexico the same way again. And I don't know that I have the patience for anyone who just, I bet the tacos were good. And I'd be like, I hate you. Like I was so
Mhm.
resentful of that kind of ignorance. And in some cases, like people who are innocently just like, tell me about your time. And I would say, do you have a couple of days? Because that's what it would take me to tell you what I learned. I was arrogant and just caught up in my feelings and my identity that I didn't think I owed anybody anything. And I felt like I was deservedly, you don't get to know this. And that through, I would say, changed through learning more and more about popular education. A big influence was this idea that there's no such thing as there shouldn't be. We shouldn't operate as education as this sort of achievable end goal thing, or there's a certain kind of data that you need that needs to be implanted in us, but that we're all continuously and constantly learning. And any way we can make it liberatory, any way we can make it a force for changing society and the world towards being less exploitative, less discriminatory, the better. And so, what I say to my class, I still teach a class at K College called Global Social Movements and Speaking Up for Justice. I start the course now with this idea. I said, listen, I hope if nothing else in the last years has shown you, we do not have an option to write off people. If we write off people because of where they're born and what they have had exposure to and what they have not, we are just admitting defeat. And for people like me with the privilege to be able to blend in with communities by the way I talk, by the way I look, if we just say, I'm really comfortable in my communities of progressive social justice folks, And I just say, forget you all. I don't owe you anything. There are real consequences as a society to doing. Like I really am trying to instill in students at K college, like in that first year for their first quarter, if you don't think you have any responsibility to do popular education and to bring things back that you're learning, that you believe in, that you're passionate about, you're not really engaged in this sort of longer term project of we don't want to always be here and we have a long fight ahead of us. This is a marathon. So it's been evolving. I can't say that I know exactly how in where I am right now, but I'm still trying to figure out my duty, my responsibility to figure out how to have conversations that for a long time I was just like, I'm not talking to you.
That earlier state you were in, was there also a part of it where you separated yourself too from the whiteness, from the white supremacy?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like I want to be really careful how I say this. It's as a white cisgendered male, I'm never really outside of the hegemonic white culture of the United States and all the benefits that it gives me. But in college in particular, I was on like an intramural soccer team that some of the guys were saying ignorant, racist shit. And I started confronting them about it. And they would tease me, and there was a critical mass that didn't agree with me. And so I ended up quitting that team because of it. And so I started to make pretty strategic cuts of people who were not down. Who were not down for having more in-depth conversations in general, but in particular about social justice, anti-racism, anti-homophobia. So I did separate from a lot of friendships that were, I felt like just not going to take me anywhere, like
Mm,
in a progressive direction. And instead leaning into the relationships of people who were like, "Hey, you're interested in learning more about this? Come over." I was like, "Yeah, why would I spend my time with other people who don't even want to talk about it and pretend like it doesn't exist?" So I would say there was that separation for
okay,
sure.
okay.
But it wasn't a separation of not seeing myself as white or not seeing myself as having a number of things that society gives benefits to. But yeah, I really did. I loved being welcomed and invited into the Black Greek culture at Grand Valley, other social justice organizations, and the activist organizations that were mainly white, like Students Against Sweatshops they were wondering about like, well, why aren't students of color coming to our meetings and all that? And
Mm,
I was involved in going to campus events that were talking about racism. And I was involved with folks in the alphas and the deltas that I was going to their events, like out of personal interest, out
yeah,
of care for people that I had come to love.
yeah,
And so then I would say to those meetings of those white activists, I would say like, why would anybody come to these meetings? You're not going to their things and you're trying to be like on top of what you're already fighting against and a campus that at the time was, I think, 92% like PWI. Like it was like, why are the demands on them to want to come here when you're not doing much in the other way around? I still did activist stuff with predominantly white students at Grand Valley and then had this other life too. So I would say like I was negotiating both, but being in housing and having like jobs, like I was a multicultural assistant, like I was in a role that I didn't even apply for, but a mentor, Marlene, said, "You should do this." And I was like, "I'm all these identities that I don't think are supposed to be a multicultural student." She said, "No, but you need to. That's like what we need." And I didn't have that understanding at the time. And so I came from it from that place of, yeah, I can access white students in a way that other folks can't. And I'm going to do the best I can with it without pretending that I doing it better or anything, but just that it's an access thing.